The boss wanted to slip some money into the cleaner's wallet to help her, but when he opened it, he found something that changed his life forever. Tucker was walking down the long office corridor contemplating the upcoming meeting with suppliers. The usual hustle and bustle surrounded him. Employees were darting back and forth, someone was talking loudly on the phone, while others were absorbed in their work at their computers. However, something seemed out of sync with the general rhythm. In the corner behind the supply cabinet, he noticed a figure. A young woman with her head bowed was sitting on a low bench. It was Cassidy, one of the cleaning staff. She was carefully folding a handkerchief, and her eyes, red from crying, betrayed her state. Tucker paused. He wasn't the kind of person to walk past someone else's troubles, especially when the girl looked so lost. "Cassidy," he called softly as he approached. "Is everything okay? Can I help you with something?" The girl flinched, as if caught doing something shameful. She quickly wiped her face with the handkerchief and looked up at Tucker. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Everything's fine. I'm sorry, I'll get back to work now." Tucker frowned. Her voice trembled, and her gaze was full of embarrassment. Clearly, everything was not fine. "Cassidy, are you sure you're okay?" he insisted. "Did someone upset you? Maybe I can help?" "No, really, it's fine," she replied quickly, standing up. "Sorry for the trouble. I'll get back to work." Her words were hurried, her movements nervous. She turned and left, leaving Tucker standing alone. He remained there, watching her go. A multitude of questions swirled in his mind. What could have upset her so much? Why had none of the other employees noticed? The thought that someone in his company, where he worked hard to maintain a friendly atmosphere, might have driven a worker to tears made him uncomfortable. Tucker walked down the corridor, thoughtfully rubbing his chin. He didn't know Cassidy well, but he had heard she diligently performed her duties. Employees rarely noticed the cleaning staff, but Tucker believed they deserved no less respect than anyone else. It was unpleasant to realize that someone might have mistreated Cassidy. Reaching his office, he stopped at the door, glancing in the direction where the girl had just disappeared. The office maintained its usual business-like atmosphere, and it seemed no one cared that someone in this large building had just been crying. "There's no smoke without fire," he thought, entering his office and closing the door behind him. Sitting at his desk, he placed his palms on the surface and closed his eyes for a moment. He wanted to understand what had upset Cassidy so much. He wasn't the kind of person to leave such questions unanswered. Turning in his chair, Tucker looked at the phone. Who here understands people better than anyone else? He asked himself. The answer was obvious. Mrs. Thompson. She had been with the company for a long time, knew all the employees and their relationships. Tucker realized he needed to invite her for a conversation. His thoughts returned to Cassidy. Modest, quiet. She seemed like the kind of person who would never cause trouble. But her red eyes and trembling voice indicated she was struggling. If no one else noticed, then it was up to him to address it. He dialed Mrs. Thompson's number and, upon hearing her voice, calmly requested, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson. Could you stop by my office in about 10 minutes? I need to discuss something." Tucker leaned back in his chair. He was determined to find out what was going on and, if necessary, help Cassidy. Tucker sat at his desk, impatiently tapping his fingers on the wooden surface. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. "Yes, come in," he responded. A stately woman in her 50s with a kind yet stern face appeared in the doorway. Her work attire was neatly pressed. "Yes, Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to talk to you. But first, tea. Let's sit down and have a calm conversation, like people," he smiled. "Coffee from the boss? That's something new," she retuckered playfully, settling into a chair. "Usually you're all about business. Today is about business too, but perhaps more important than usual," Tucker replied seriously, placing a cup in front of her. "Tell me, how is Cassidy?" "How does she fit in with the team?" Mrs. Thompson frowned, as if deciding whether to share what she knew. Taking a sip of tea, she began. "The girl is hard-working, no doubt about that. But her life isn't easy, Tucker. and some of our fashionistas in the department add salt to the wound. Tucker leaned forward. What do you mean? Please explain. Well, there's not much to explain, she sighed. Around here, it's all about appearances. Expensive clothes, manicures, makeup. And Cassidy? She's naturally beautiful, but clearly living modestly. That seems to bother them. Out of jealousy, I suppose. They mock her, call her the queen of the slums or worse. Tucker frowned. He tried to maintain an atmosphere of respect within the company, but what he heard made him reconsider. Educated people behaving this way? He thought such behavior was impossible in their office. How long has this been going on? Since she started, Mrs. Thompson nodded. I told her to ignore it, but she takes it to heart. At home, things aren't easy either. Her mother is sick, they can't get disability benefits, and the medications are expensive. She has to work twice as hard to make ends meet. And our colleagues? Well, they giggle and sneer. Tucker was boiling with irritation. These jokes seemed petty and unworthy to him, and the fact that someone like Cassidy was under constant pressure evoked genuine indignation. And what about Cassidy? He asked. How is she coping? She stays silent. What else can she do? She works hard, tries not to show any signs of distress. But as you saw, she couldn't hold back her tears. And then she went back to work. Tucker pondered, rubbing his chin. He admired Cassidy's resilience, but the fact that she had to battle so many difficulties alone at such a young age evoked a mix of respect and sympathy. I never would have thought this was possible in our team. We need to do something urgently. I know you, Tucker, Mrs. Thompson suddenly smirked. Once you take on something, you don't back down. The girl could use some help. Just be careful with it. She's proud and might not accept it. Tucker thought deeply. He felt he couldn't stand by. He wanted not only to help Cassidy, but also to understand why such attitudes were allowed in his company in the first place. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. You've been very helpful. Now please return to your duties, and I'll think of something, he said, escorting her to the door. When the door closed behind her, Tucker sank back into his chair. He knew this was just the beginning, but he was determined to make a change. Tucker was left alone in his office. Resting his elbows on the desk and interlocking his fingers, he pondered. Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in his mind. The queen of the slums. The donkey's skin. These insults reverberated in his thoughts. He never would have thought such a thing was possible in his company. The team he considered cohesive and intelligent turned out to be not so ideal. He looked out the window at the bustling street. The people on the sidewalk seemed like tiny figures, each carrying their own burden. And yet, we all face difficulties, Tucker reflected. But why do some help, while others make life harder? Tucker knew Cassidy wouldn't complain. She was the type to silently endure her troubles. Her behavior indicated she was proud and independent. However, this situation couldn't be ignored. A girl already carrying a heavy burden shouldn't suffer from someone's malice or envy. But how to allow this? Tucker asked himself. How could such things happen in a team of educated people? Why didn't anyone intervene? It wasn't just disappointment. He felt there was a bigger problem. Perhaps people were used to ignoring such moments, turning a blind eye to injustice to avoid conflicts. Tucker stood up, paced the office, then sat down again. He realized he had to step in. It didn't matter how others would perceive his actions. What mattered was that inaction essentially supported injustice. He couldn't allow himself to remain indifferent. But how to do it, he mused. If he openly defended Cassidy, it might embarrass her, or even make her more vulnerable. But if he stayed in the shadows, the problem might never be resolved. He needed to find the right way to not only help the girl, but also make the team understand that such behavior was unacceptable. Mrs. Thompson's words about Cassidy being proud and possibly not accepting help complicated the task. The intervention had to be conducted so that Cassidy felt supported, not reproached. Tucker looked out the window again. His decision was made. He wouldn't sit idly by. Even if it was difficult, even if it took time, he would fight this injustice. If I don't start acting, then who will, he thought, feeling a firm resolve ignite within him. He returned to his desk, opened his laptop, and jotted down a few notes to develop a plan. First, he needed to find out how he could help Cassidy, then figure out who and why allowed themselves such mockery, and most importantly, change the atmosphere in the team so that this wouldn't happen again. Tucker knew there might be resistance. Some might consider his actions excessive or accuse him of meddling in matters that weren't his business. But he was ready. This wasn't just a company matter. It was a matter of conscience. Here's a refined version with added details, improved flow, and some dialogue to enhance the scene. Tucker struggled to find a way to help Cassidy. He didn't want to make a scene or publicly display his support in front of the team. It might embarrass her, or even make things worse in the eyes of her colleagues. The only solution, he decided, was to do something anonymously, ensuring she wouldn't guess where the help came from. That morning, as he got ready for work, Tucker took out his wallet and flipped through the bills. This should be enough to buy some clothes or groceries, he thought, counting the cash. Money wasn't an issue for him, but he knew that leaving too much might raise suspicion. It had to feel like an accident, like someone had simply misplaced it, just enough to offer relief, not enough to make her question the source. The workday dragged on as usual, but Tucker's mind was elsewhere. He waited patiently, watching the clock, counting down the minutes until lunch. He needed the perfect moment, when no one would be around. Finally, the office emptied. The halls were silent except for the distant hum of voices from the cafeteria. The cleaning staff had disappeared into the main hall, where there was always plenty of work. Now, Tucker made his way to the storage room, where the cleaning staff usually left their belongings. The small space smelled of disinfectant and damp mop heads. Against the wall stood a shelf lined with buckets, mops, and a few personal bags. His eyes landed on Cassidy's, modest, slightly worn, its fabric fraying at the edges. It was neatly fastened but not locked. He hesitated for a moment, then unzipped it carefully. Inside, he found a small, faded wallet. Opening it, he saw a few crumpled bills and a handful of coins. Almost nothing. A tightness formed in his chest. How does she even get by? For a second, he just stood there, staring at the paltry amount, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then, with quiet determination, he pulled the folded bills from his pocket and prepared to slip them inside. But just as he was about to place them in the wallet, his fingers brushed against something, a small familiar object buried beneath the bills. Tucker froze. His breath hitched as he pulled it out, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. "No way!" he whispered under his breath, staring at the item in his palm. It was impossible. Yet here it was, a relic from his past, tucked away in Cassidy's wallet. It was a small gold cross. Tucker froze. It was so unusual that Tucker couldn't help but recognize it. It was his father's cross. He took it in his hands, trying to comprehend what was happening. No, Tucker wasn't mistaken. This was his father's cross. The familiar weight of it in his palm sent a shock through his system. His fingers traced the delicate engraving, his father's initials etched into the metal on both sides. His mind raced. He couldn't be wrong. He knew this cross. He had spent countless childhood afternoons playing with it, running his tiny fingers over its cool surface as he sat on his father's lap. It was more than just an object, it was a memory, a piece of his past. But what was it doing here? His stomach twisted. Had Cassidy stolen it? Had someone given it to her? Or was there another explanation? A dozen possibilities flooded his mind, none of them making sense. Tucker clenched his jaw. Slowly he exhaled, forcing himself to think rationally. He couldn't jump to conclusions. Not yet. He looked back at Cassidy's worn bag, at the wallet, at the few meager belongings she had. Tucker's breath came in short, uneven bursts. The weight of realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. The day his father's cross disappeared. That day. the day their lives changed forever. His mind reeled, forcing him back to that fateful afternoon, the blurred images sharpened like a film strip coming into focus. The car, the rain-slicked road, his mother, unconscious in the back seat, his father throwing the door open, rushing to help the woman trapped in the other vehicle, and then her. A little girl, no older than 6, standing by the roadside. Wide, terrified eyes locked onto his. She had been shaking, her small frame barely visible in the heavy downpour. And the woman? Her mother, perhaps, reaching out from the wreckage, desperate, hands trembling. He could still hear the strained, gasping plea she had managed to whisper as she tore the cross from his father's neck. "Please, help!" Then, chaos. Sirens. Flashing lights. Blood. Tucker swallowed hard. Cassidy. Could she be that little girl? The realization made his chest tighten. His fingers curled around the edges of the bag as he stared down at it, his pulse hammering in his ears. How had fate led them here after so many years? And the cross. Why had it ended up with Cassidy? Had her mother kept it all this time? A token of that tragic day? A reminder of the man who had once stopped to help? Tucker exhaled shakily. His attempt at quiet, anonymous help had turned into something far bigger. He could no longer just slip a few bills into her wallet and walk away. He needed to know the truth. Slowly, he pulled the money back from her wallet and slipped it into his own pocket, his hands trembling. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, trying to steady himself. Then, carefully, he zipped the bag closed and held it against his chest for a moment, grounding himself in the storm of emotions raging inside him. What now? His attempt at anonymous help had turned into something more. Tucker couldn't just leave the money and pretend nothing had happened. He understood that he now had to find out the whole truth. Putting the money back in his pocket, Tucker wiped the sweat from his forehead. His heart pounded like a hammer. He left the storage room, trying not to make a sound. For a moment it seemed to him that someone was watching him, but the corridor was empty. Returning to his office, he sat at his desk and exhaled heavily. His thoughts were tangled, and his soul felt a strange sense of destiny. Even if he didn't want it, he could no longer brush off the past. Everything had become more complicated than he had anticipated. Tucker sat in his office trying to cope with the flood of memories. The cross from Cassidy's wallet wouldn't leave him alone. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't notice the time passing. Deciding to pull himself together, he got up and headed back to the storage room to finish what he had started. He was sure, despite everything, he needed to leave the money in the wallet. Quietly entering the storage room, Tucker opened Cassidy's bag again. Cassidy's wallet was right where he had left it. Tucker swallowed hard, his pulse quickening as he reached for it. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully unzipped it, doing his best to make no noise. "I need to do this quickly and leave," he thought, slipping the bills from his pocket. But just as he was about to tuck the money inside, a quiet voice cut through the silence. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" Tucker's breath caught in his throat. He turned sharply, heart hammering against his ribs. Cassidy stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. Her brows knitted together as her gaze flickered from his face to her bag, her open bag, before returning to him. She hadn't expected to find her boss rummaging through her belongings. Tucker opened his mouth, then closed it again. His mind scrambled for the right words, but all that came out was a hesitant, "Cassidy," his voice faltered. "It's not what you think. I wanted to help you." Cassidy took a step closer, her frown deepening. "Help? How exactly? By going through my bag?" The accusation, though quiet, made his stomach twist. Heat rushed to his face. He had prepared for a lot of things, but not this. Taking a steadying breath, he lifted the money toward her. "Listen, I know things aren't easy for you. I just wanted to make sure you weren't struggling." His voice softened. "Please take it. It's just a small gesture." Cassidy's gaze dropped to the bills in his hand, her face suddenly tense. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, a quiet bitterness crept into her voice. "You thought I needed handouts?" Tucker saw the flicker of something in her eyes, pride, hurt, frustration. "No, thank you." Her tone was firm. "I'll manage on my own." He exhaled, trying again. "Cassidy, you don't understand," he said gently. "It's not charity. It's not a handout. It's just a gesture of goodwill. That's why I didn't want you to know, so you wouldn't feel embarrassed." She looked away, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. The fight between pride and reality played out in her posture, in the way she shifted slightly, but didn't leave. Finally, she whispered, "Why?" Her eyes met his, uncertain and searching. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." Tucker hesitated. He couldn't tell her everything. Not now. Not yet. Instead, he said the only thing that felt true in that moment. "Because I believe you deserve more than the unfairness life keeps throwing at you. And if I can help change that, I will." Cassidy held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she let out a soft sigh. "Okay," she murmured. "But let's agree on one thing. This is the first and last time. I'm not used to accepting money like this." Tucker gave a small nod. She took the extended bills, carefully tucked them into her wallet, and placed it back in her bag. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but don't do this again. Just ask if you want to help." Tucker smiled, feeling the tension ease slightly. "I promise," he replied. She turned and left, leaving him alone. He watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and embarrassment. Perhaps now they could understand each other better, even through an awkward moment. Tucker couldn't gather his thoughts for a long time, but he understood that a conversation with his father was inevitable. The gold cross and Cassidy, who might have been connected to that fateful day, tormented his soul. He couldn't keep it to himself any longer. Late in the evening, he dialed his father's number. "Dad, are you home?" His voice was tense. "Yes, I'm home." "What's wrong?" his father replied, sensing something was amiss. "Yes, we need to talk. It's important. I'll be there in an hour," Tucker said, hanging up before his father could respond. When Tucker entered his father's house, his father was already waiting for him in the living room. He held a cup of coffee in his hands, and his face showed slight concern. "What happened?" he asked, nodding toward the chair. Tucker sat down but didn't take the coffee. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to gather his thoughts. "Dad, do you remember the day we were taking Mom to the hospital? The accident on the road?" he finally said. His father frowned as if wanting to say something, but instead he just sighed. "Of course I remember," he replied after a pause. "You don't forget something like that." Tucker nodded, feeling the long-suppressed anger begin to boil inside him. "Why didn't we help those people, Dad? The woman and the girl from that car?" His father got up from the chair and walked around the room. He stopped by the window, clasping his hands behind his back. "We had no choice, Tucker," he said in a hollow voice. "Your mother was dying. If we had delayed, she might have... well, she wouldn't have survived." "But she didn't survive anyway," Tucker interrupted sharply, standing up. "You knew that, Dad. You knew time was running out, but you abandoned that woman. We didn't even call an ambulance for them. I was desperate." His father turned to his son, his voice trembling. "Can't you understand? I had a dying wife in the car, your mother. How could I leave her for strangers?" Tucker clenched his fists but forced himself to speak calmly. "Those strangers," Dad remembered that day for the rest of their lives. The woman became disabled, and her daughter, the child you left on the roadside, works for me. Can you imagine what I felt when I saw that cross in her wallet?" His father looked as if he had been slapped in the face. He slowly sank back into the chair and clutched his temples. "That cross... with her?" he whispered. "Yes." Tucker sat opposite, looking his father straight in the eyes. Do you remember how she tore it from your neck, pleading for help? She held it as her last hope, and you just drove away. Enough, his father's voice rose. Do you think it's easy for me to live with this? I remember that day every day. But we're not to blame, Tucker. We didn't hit their car. It was her, an inexperienced driver who lost control. Maybe you're right, Dad, but is that an excuse? We could have helped. We should have helped, not left them there. Tucker stood up, looking at his father with despair. How can you talk about innocence when the woman was left crippled and her daughter grew up in poverty because of us? His father closed his eyes as if trying to suppress the rising pain. A heavy silence hung in the room. Finally, he said, "Do you think I don't understand that? Do you think it doesn't hurt me? Yes, I made a choice. And every time I remember that day, I curse myself. But we can't turn back time, Tucker. We can't change the past." Tucker leaned closer, his voice becoming quieter but firmer. No, Dad. We can't change the past, but we can help them now. They're still here, living with these memories, with these consequences. You can do something to make their lives easier. Don't you want to at least try? His father looked up. In his eyes was a mix of fear and guilt. "And what do you want from me?" he asked hollowly. "First, we need to find out how to help. That girl's mother, Cassidy, is still sick. She's disabled and needs treatment. We can pay for it. That will be just the beginning." His father was silent for a long time. Finally, he nodded, as if making a decision within himself. "Okay," he said. "If there's anything I can do to make their lives easier, I'll do it." Tucker felt a sense of relief, but also a strange heaviness. He knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but the first step had been taken. The next day, Tucker decided to talk to Cassidy. He invited her to his office, trying to choose a time when the office was less busy. The girl entered, slightly embarrassed, lowering her head but trying to remain calm. "Please have a seat, Cassidy," he offered, pointing to the chair. "I'd like to talk to you, if you don't mind, of course," she replied quietly, adjusting her uniform. "Did I do something wrong?" No, everything's fine," Tucker hurried to reassure her. "I just wanted to learn a bit more about you. How are you? How's life?" Cassidy was a bit surprised but answered, "Everything's okay. Just working, as usual." Tucker nodded, but continued to look at her as if trying to understand what she was not saying. "Cassidy," he began gently, "I know your situation isn't easy. You work a lot, don't you?" She nodded, lowering her eyes. "I have to," she replied. "My mom and I don't have other options." Tucker leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Tell me about your mom. Is she sick?" Cassidy froze for a moment, then slowly nodded. "Yes, she has back problems. We were in an accident many years ago, and since then, she can't stand or walk for long. Initially, the pain was bearable, but now she can barely move without help. Doctors say she needs serious treatment, but we just don't have the money for it." Tucker felt something tighten in his chest. He understood what accident she was referring to, but didn't want to bring it up just yet. Instead, he continued, "I heard you work multiple jobs. Is that true?" Cassidy smiled wearily. "Yes. I also work as a night guard and clean staircases in my neighborhood late in the evening. The salary here isn't enough, but it's temporary. Once we save enough for the treatment, well, we'll see." "And what about education?" he asked cautiously. "You're still young. You could go to college. Why didn't you try?" A hint of sadness crossed Cassidy's face. "I wanted to," she admitted. "I even applied after high school, but then Mom got really sick. We didn't have the money to pay, so I had to withdraw my application. Since then, it's just been about work." Tucker was silent, not knowing what to say. He saw before him a person who had to give up her dreams for her family. There was no complaint in her words, just a calm acceptance of the situation. This resilience impressed him. "Cassidy, I admire your strength," he finally said. "Not everyone your age could take on so much responsibility." She smiled shyly but quickly looked away. Thank you. But what can you do? Everyone has their own life. This is ours. Tucker thought for a moment. He saw how Cassidy tried not to show weakness, but her eyes spoke more than words. Behind this resilience lay fatigue, and perhaps fear of the future. Have you ever thought about asking for help? He asked gently. Cassidy shook her head. Nobody helps anyone just like that. And if they do, they expect something in return. We've learned to rely only on ourselves. Her words further strengthened his resolve to help. Tucker realized this girl deserved a different future, and he would do everything possible to give her a chance for something better. Cassidy, if you had the opportunity, would you want to go back to studying? He asked. She looked at him, as if not believing her ears. Of course I would, she replied quietly, but right now it's impossible. Tucker nodded, trying to hide a smile. He knew her life was about to change. She just didn't know it yet. Quentin couldn't shake off the heavy thoughts that plagued him after the conversation with his son. His actions on the highway 20 years ago were now returning with double the force. Tucker insisted that he meet with Cassidy's mother and try to help. And Quentin, though feeling internal resistance, couldn't refuse. He understood. It was his duty. The meeting was arranged by Tucker. He agreed that Quentin would visit them at home under the pretext of personal assistance. When Quentin arrived, Cassidy met him, a little surprised but still welcoming. Tucker's dad? Please, come in, she said, letting him into a small but tidy apartment. Mum's in the room? I'll call her. Quentin noticed how modestly and neatly the apartment was furnished. Old but well-kept things, simple furniture. Everything spoke of people who were used to getting by with little. A minute later, a woman with a cane entered the room. Quentin immediately realized it was Cassidy's mother. Her face, though aged, was familiar to him. It was her, the woman who had lain on the highway, clutching his cross. Quentin, she said with difficulty, sitting down in a chair. Her voice was quiet, but it carried surprise. Yes, it's me, he replied, feeling guilt tighten in his chest. You probably remember me. From that day, I came to talk and apologize. The woman raised her eyes in which pain, surprise, and sadness mingled. Of course I remember, she said. You don't forget things like that. But why have you come now after all these years? Quentin took a deep breath and sat across from her. Her. He gathered his thoughts before speaking. I know I did a terrible thing. Back then, I was only thinking about saving my wife. But leaving you there, I've never forgiven myself for it all these years. Daisy was silent, studying him. I know I'm asking a lot, but I want to atone for my guilt. I heard from Tucker that you need treatment. Let me help. I want to pay for everything you need to get back on your feet. She shook her head, as if not believing her ears. I've lived with this pain for many years, she finally said. Pain not only physical, but also from being abandoned that day. I tried to understand. Why? Now, listening to you, I begin to understand. She paused, then asked, but why now? Why did you decide only now? Because now I know how much it affected you and your daughter, Quentin replied. I understand you don't have to forgive me, but please let me at least help. Daisy was silent for a long time. It was clear that an internal struggle was going on inside her. Finally, she quietly said, You know, I hated you for a long time. I remembered that day and cursed you for leaving us. She looked at him long and intently. But the years passed and I realized hatred changes nothing. She paused, taking a deep breath. Now, listening to you, I see that you genuinely regret it. She lowered her eyes. Perhaps I can forgive you. Quentin felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he held them back. Thank you, Daisy, he said quietly. I'll do everything to make sure you and your daughter get what you deserve. She nodded, and a light smile appeared on her face for the first time in a long time. This means a lot to me. and to Cassidy too. Quentin stood up, looking at her with gratitude. I'll contact the best doctors, and we'll start treatment as soon as possible. Daisy nodded again, tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time in many years, she felt that life could change for the better. Quentin, leaving, realized that this conversation was the beginning of his path to redemption. Tucker knew that the moment to talk to Cassidy was inevitable. After meeting her mother, he realized he couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer. It was a difficult step, but he understood. Without honesty, they couldn't move forward. He invited Cassidy to his office. This time his voice was slightly tense, which she immediately noticed. "Did something happen, Tucker?" she asked, entering and sitting on the edge of the chair. He lingered on her gaze for a moment. Cassidy looked a bit anxious but tried to hold herself confidently. Tucker sighed and began to speak. "Cassidy, I want to tell you a story. It's important, and I ask you to listen to the end." She tilted her head slightly, not understanding where he was going. "Okay," she replied briefly. Tucker stood up and began pacing the office, carefully considering each word. "Many years ago, when I was 10, my mum fell seriously ill. We were rushing her to the hospital, desperate. Time was running out. There was an accident on the road." He stopped, looking at Cassidy. "A car overturned. There was a woman and a little girl in it. We didn't touch them, but it happened. Because of us." Cassidy remained silent, her face serious, but she didn't interrupt. "My father stopped to help," Tucker continued, "but when he saw that my mum in the back seat was barely breathing, he made a choice." Tucker took a deep breath. "We drove away. We left them there." His voice trembled. "That girl, it was you, Cassidy, and the woman was your mom." He fell silent, giving her time to process what she had heard. Cassidy looked at him. Her face was motionless, but her eyes reflected a mix of emotions. Surprise, disbelief, shock. "Are you saying you were in that car?" she finally asked, her voice hollow. Tucker nodded. "Yes. I recognized you when I saw the cross in your wallet. It was my father's cross. Back then, on the highway, your mum tore it from his neck, pleading for help." He sighed heavily. "I knew that sooner or later I would have to tell you this." Cassidy pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "So, you just drove away? Left us there?" Her voice trembled. "Yes," Tucker said quietly. "We made a mistake. We made a terrible choice, and I know neither I nor my father can justify ourselves, but we want to atone for our guilt. At least now." She stood up and began pacing the room. "I always wondered why no one helped us then," she said, turning to him. "My mom said we were abandoned. I thought those people were just cruel. And now you come and say it was you?" "I understand that it's hard to accept," Tucker said, "but please, give us a chance to make it right." He looked at her, but Cassidy didn't respond. "My father is already arranging treatment for your mom. I'm ready to help you with your studies, with work. We want to help you build the life you deserve." "You think money will fix everything?" she asked sharply, her voice filled with bitterness. "No," Tucker replied firmly. "Money won't bring back the years you lost. But if we do nothing now, it will be another betrayal." He looked her in the eye. "We want to show that we sincerely regret it, and we're ready to do everything to at least partially make up for it." She fell silent again. A struggle was evident in her eyes. It was clear she wanted to reject his offer, but something inside held her back. "I don't know how to react," she finally said. "It's too much for me, too unexpected." "I understand," Tucker said. "Take your time, think about it. We're not in a hurry, but know that you can count on us. We'll do whatever it takes." She nodded. Her eyes were full of tears. It hurt her. But at the same time, there was something new in her gaze. Hope. Tucker knew this was only the first step, but he felt he had done the right thing by telling her the truth. Now everything depended on her decision. Daisy's treatment began almost immediately. Quentin contacted leading specialists, and they agreed to admit her to their clinic. Cassidy initially hesitated, reluctant to accept help, but her mother eventually convinced her. "Cassidy, sweetie, this might be my only chance to walk again," Daisy said, squeezing Cassidy's hand. "If it weren't for them, I'd just be living out my days in this apartment." "Okay, Mom, let's try," Cassidy finally relented. Her voice was filled with hope and fear at the same time. The clinic was one of the best. Daisy was examined, underwent a series of tests, and a treatment plan was developed, which included surgery and extended rehabilitation. Quentin paid for everything down to the last penny without asking unnecessary questions. He often visited Daisy in the clinic, bringing Cassidy so she could support her mother. "You're making good progress," one of the doctors said a month after the treatment began. "If things continue at this pace, in 6 months, you'll be able to walk without a cane." These words were a true gift for Daisy. She cried with joy when she shared the news with her daughter. "Can you imagine, Cassidy? I'll be able to walk again." Her face shone with happiness. "I'm so happy, Mom," Cassidy replied, hugging her. "It's the best thing that could have happened." Cassidy herself began to notice how her life was changing. First, Quentin insisted that she stop working multiple jobs. He helped cover her expenses, allowing her to focus on her own life. Tucker offered Cassidy the chance to return to studying, and though she had doubts, she accepted his offer. "I'll help you choose a good university," Tucker said. "You'll be able to do what you truly love." "I've always dreamed of becoming a designer," Cassidy admitted, "but I thought it was impossible." "Nothing is impossible," he smiled. "You have all the abilities for it." The application process wasn't easy, but with Tucker's support, Cassidy managed to get through all the stages. She began her studies, allowing herself to dream about the future for the first time in many years. Now her days were filled not only with responsibilities, but also with passion. She felt her life was gradually changing. Daisy completed her rehabilitation course 6 months later. Her steps were initially cautious and uncertain. On the day she left the clinic without a cane, she was met by Cassidy, Tucker, and Quentin. She hugged each of them, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." "I don't know how to express my gratitude," she said, looking at Quentin. "No words are needed," he replied. "Just live your life and be happy." Tucker felt a weight lift from his heart. This was what he had been waiting for from the beginning, to see their help bring real changes to these women's lives. He often found himself thinking that Cassidy had become more than just someone he wanted to help. "Do you see how everything is changing?" he once said to his father as they returned from the clinic. "We can't fix the past, but now we've done something good." Quentin nodded silently. His face was calm, but his eyes reflected relief. He knew he had at least partially atoned for his guilt. Now Daisy and Cassidy were living a new life. Daisy went out more often, took walks and met with neighbours. She was proud that her daughter was now studying at a university and striving for her dream. Cassidy, in turn, felt her future was filled with meaning. Tucker continued to support them. He was happy to see how their lives were changing and was proud to be part of these changes. Quentin, though more reserved, often visited Daisy and was always pleased with her progress. These changes were not just the result of efforts for Tucker and his father, but a way to find peace within themselves. They realized that even the gravest mistakes could lead to growth if you make an effort and do everything possible to rectify the consequences. Life returned to its tracks, but now it was brighter and more meaningful for everyone involved in this story. After each visit, Tucker and Cassidy increasingly found themselves alone, discussing current affairs or simply sharing thoughts. Cassidy gradually began to trust Tucker, seeing his genuine interest not only in her well-being, but also in her dreams. One evening, when Daisy was already resting after another rehabilitation session, Tucker suggested they take a walk in the park. It was a quiet place with paths winding between tall trees, and the air carried a light scent of pine. "Do you always care so much about people?" Cassidy asked, looking at him with a smile. Tucker shrugged, slightly embarrassed. Caring is something I'm still learning. I used to be too absorbed in work and my problems. But your story changed a lot in me. Cassidy stopped, turning to him. It seems like you're doing more than you have to. Why? Tucker thought for a moment. Because I want you to have the life you deserve. You've carried so much on your shoulders for too long. He hesitated slightly, then added, and also because I respect you. Honestly, I enjoy spending time with you. Her eyes widened in surprise, but then she smiled. It was a warm, genuine smile that Tucker saw on her face for the first time. Thank you, she said quietly. I'm not used to hearing such words. They continued walking, but after that conversation, something changed between them. Cassidy became more open, and with each passing day, their communication became more personal. Tucker shared stories about his life, his mother, and how he struggled with the guilt of that day. Cassidy, in turn, shared her fears and dreams. When Daisy completed her treatment, their bond grew even stronger. Cassidy increasingly turned to Tucker for advice, and he was happy to support her. They began planning her studies and discussing her future career. Cassidy noticed that Tucker didn't just want to help, he believed in her like no one else before. One day, while they were preparing documents for her admission, Cassidy suddenly looked at Tucker and said, "You've changed my life. I don't even know what to say." "Just be happy," he replied, looking at her. "That's the most important thing to me." At that moment, she realized that he had become more than just someone who helped her. Tucker was something more. These feelings grew gradually, and now she couldn't imagine her life without him. A year passed. The wedding day was sunny, as if nature itself was blessing Tucker and Cassidy. The hall where the celebration took place was tastefully decorated, white tablecloths, fresh flowers on the tables, and soft lighting creating a cozy atmosphere. Everyone present felt that this day was not just a celebration of love, but a symbol of a new beginning. Cassidy looked incredible. Her dress, sewn from her own sketches, highlighted her natural beauty. Daisy couldn't take her eyes off her daughter, her eyes glistening with tears of happiness. "You look like a fairy tale," she said, holding Cassidy's hand. "I never dreamed I'd see you so happy." "It's all thanks to you, Mom," Cassidy replied, hugging her. "You taught me to fight and never give up." Among the guests were Tucker's colleagues, including Mrs. Thompson, who had always supported. Cassidy. She smiled, holding a glass of champagne. "Well, now everything's truly great for our girl," she said, addressing Quentin, who stood nearby. "And you, Quentin, are a good man. A real father." He smiled, but there was a hint of embarrassment in his eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'm glad I could be part of this," he replied. The former bullies from the office were also present at the wedding. They kept to themselves, visibly nervous and whispering among themselves. Finally, one of them, Amber, gathered the courage to approach Cassidy. "Cassidy," she began hesitantly, lowering her eyes. "We wanted to apologize." She hesitated, but then mustered the courage. "We behaved badly. Please forgive us." Cassidy looked at her. Her face remained calm. "It's in the past," she replied. "I don't hold a grudge, but I hope you've learned to respect others." Amber nodded, blushing, and hurried back to the others. This moment was the final closure of that chapter in Cassidy's life. When the dance began, Daisy stood without assistance for a long time and even twirled to the slow melody, smiling shyly. Quentin approached her. "Daisy, you're an amazing woman," he said. "I'm glad everything worked out for you," she replied with a gentle smile. "Quentin, thank you for everything. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here today." Tucker and Cassidy danced their first dance as husband and wife. Their faces glowed with happiness, and their eyes reflected confidence in the future. This day was a symbol of their new life, where there was no place for pain and regret. After the wedding, as guests began to leave, Tucker and Quentin remained in silence on the terrace of the hall. They sat side by side, looking at the evening sky painted in shades of pink and orange. "Dad," Tucker began, turning to his father. You know, I thought I'd never be able to forgive you for that day. Quentin looked at his son attentively. I know, he replied quietly, and you had every right to. I couldn't forgive myself for a long time. Tucker nodded thoughtfully. But now I understand that you did everything you could in that situation. We both made mistakes, but you proved you can take responsibility, help me and Cassidy change their lives. If it weren't for you, Quentin said, I would have continued hiding from the past. You gave me the chance to correct my mistakes, and I'm proud to have had such a teacher as you. Tucker chuckled. I'm not much of a teacher, but I'm glad we could do this together. They fell silent, enjoying the quiet. The wind gently rustled the trees, bringing a cool breeze. Do you think we've fixed everything? Tucker asked after a long pause. I think we've done everything we could, Quentin replied. And you know, that's enough. Sometimes life gives us a second chance. The main thing is not to miss it. Tucker felt warmth spread inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt that his relationship with his father had deepened, based not only on kinship, but also on mutual respect. Thank you, Dad, he said, hugging Quentin tightly. And thank you, son, he replied. That night, they both felt that everything had truly fallen into place. Mistakes of the past were left behind, and ahead lay a life filled with love, forgiveness, and new beginnings.